webinar. So if you need to duck out or come back to it later, the recording will be available and we'll have it up on our YouTube channel. Indeed, quite possibly our website, if we can make that work by probably later today or tomorrow. So don't feel shy if you need to pop off and want to come back to it later. But thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. We're going to be performing a bit of a magic trick this morning, which is to try and condense the entirety of rail reform into a 1-hour webinar. So as you can imagine, that's going to be fairly demanding, but it's brilliant that so many people from GBRTT have been able to join us this morning. When we first conceived this webinar, it was really to focus on the call for evidence for the freight growth target, and that is very much what we want to be talking about today. But we couldn't really do that in isolation from understanding the overall programme of reform, the ambitions of GBRTT to help deliver that rail freight growth, and indeed the work of the Commission, which is kicking off at pace now, looking at reform of process, and indeed the sort of supporting legislation that underpins some of the things that we do around access charging and a whole host of other areas. So what we're going to try and do is cover all of that in an hour, and at least, if nothing else, give you an overview of what's going on and some opportunity to ask questions. As usual, you can ask your questions preferably in the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, if you must, the chat function. And we will try and get through as many of those questions in the time that we have as possible. If we can't get them all answered in time, then obviously we'll try and make a note of them and get colleagues to come back to you on those questions. But please do ask. I should also point out that I am in the office, which is a delight apart from the functioning of its Wi-Fi. Yvonne is on as co-host, so if I freeze or otherwise vanish, Connor or Yvonne will step into the space and take over from there, but please don't be surprised if I do. So I think that's all from me, and so I'm going to ask Connor, I think, who is sharing the slides, and we're going to start by going to Helen McAllister, who's the Programme Director for Freight Reform, who's going to give us an overview of how freight is going to be embedded across GBR. So thank you very much. Helen, over to you.
Hey, thanks, Maggie, for that introduction, and thank you everybody for dialing in, dialing up, whatever the correct terminology is today. It's a great opportunity for us to tell you some of the things that we're doing within the Great British Railways transition team to have a better offer for freight for your organisations, and to explain kind of what it is we need from you really over the next couple of weeks, and why we think it's a good thing for you to get involved and let us know. So if you skip down, Connor. Go. So as you may or may not know, and you probably do, the railway is undergoing reform at the moment. There is a Great British Railways transition team that has been set up to kind of work out what the pathway into the new world is of Great British Railways, where track and passenger train come together, and we do things more efficiently with less faff and give a better offer to all the users of the railway, and hopefully a better deal for the taxpayers as well. The Shapps-William plan for rail that kicks all this off was very, very clear about the fact that one of the things that needs to happen in the new world is that there needs to be a better offer for rail freight. We need to do rail freight better as a railway, and that one of the ways to do that would have a kind of central network level contact and strategy centre that could pull all the strands together and have an overview of what needs to happen on the network for freight, so that we can then make it happen, and also to make us much easier to interact with our customers, because the railway has traditionally not been all that straightforward to interact with, and we need to do that better. So the strategic freight unit that I am kind of setting up or leading at the moment is tasked with providing strategic national coordination for rail freight. Want to talk to you a bit about how our call for evidence for a rail freight growth target fits into that, and how it complements the other stuff that's going on. You will hear a lot of detail, sufficient detail hopefully, about the call for evidence over the next few slides, so I'm not going to go into that in great detail, apart from to say we have an opportunity to have a Secretary of State mandated rail freight growth target. to encourage modal shift, to help drive the UK economy, to help us reach net zero. And that's a huge opportunity. That's a huge opportunity for the railway. And I think it represents a huge opportunity for the businesses that use the railway as well. But Connor and the others will go into that some more. We haven't been sitting in a room by ourselves for the past 18 months, scratching our chins, pondering on the state of the freight world. There has been a lot of interaction with a number of different organisations, and there was a series of really deep dives over kind of a good couple of months a while ago to outline what people want from the railway, what freight end users and freight operators, what do you want from a freight offer for the railway? How do we need to change from now? We've got an unconstrained view from modelling of what growth could look like, rail freight growth could look like over the next 30 years. It could need to triple over the next 30 years in order to help deliver net zero. But obviously there's a range within that, and also the level to which each commodity grows, or each particular route grows, or new areas for rail freight spring up, is something that we do need more detail on. We need to know where to kind of target our efforts. As well as knowing what we need to accommodate, we need to be simpler and better at being able to accommodate it. And there is a commission from DfT at the moment about how to make railway processes simpler and better in order to become easier to interact with. And they're looking around 4 different work streams, which Peter will talk to you a bit about later. But it is about what should the access offer for the railway be to its customers, to its freight customers? What should performance regimes look like? What should charging regimes look like? How do we make this easier and less archaic to use? And we are also looking at how we can use R&D and innovation to help drive rail freight growth and to make it more efficient, both for the railway and the businesses that want to use it. Now, we can have all the good ideas that we like, but if there isn't a future organisation that is tasked and most importantly set up and incentivised to deliver for rail freight and that growth, then it won't happen. So one of the most important work streams we've got going on at the moment is how does freight look in Great British Railways when it goes live in 2024? How does it interact with the other parts of the organisation, both at a network level, but also at a regional level as well, where the delivery takes place? So one of the things that we are very clear about and clear about internally is that freight isn't something that is delivered by the strategic freight unit. It's not something that's solely delivered by the strategic freight unit. There is there's a whole private sector out there, and without the private sector, it won't be happening at all. But there is also a need for each part of Great British Railways to understand the importance of moving rail freight and understand the drivers of that rail freight and what each particular flow needs from the railway in order to be at its most efficient, whether that is a faster speed, whether it's different regulation, whether it's more reliable paths and less diversionary routes, less messing up due to engineering works. So the regions and other network level functions need to be freight literate when they are implementing their business plans. And so the GBR incentive model needs to be designed to ensure that all components of the railway are incentivised to deliver for rail freight, as much as they are incentivised to deliver for the passengers that use the railway as well. And I think I've milked that slide about as much as I can. So I am now going to hand over to the rest of the team to talk in more detail about the work streams that we are doing.
Thanks, Helen. Good morning, everyone. So, yeah, I will talk through the Rail Freight Growth Target Commission and the call for evidence that we're leading. So, by way of a bit of context, one of the commitments in the Plan for Rail was to set a rail freight growth target, the UK government, for the rail network, as has been done in Scotland. And following that commitment, the DfT commissioned GBRTT, specifically the strategic freight units, to develop a range of growth target options for the Secretary of State to choose from. And that commission landed November last year. And the ask from DfT was twofold, really. Firstly, to lead a call for evidence, which of course we are doing, and then to do some modelling to develop a range of options. And they have asked for some initial advice to be shared with them by the end of this year. So to do that, we've taken a kind of proportionate two-stage approach. So our deliverable for this year will be a range of CP7 options. That's stage one. And as you can see there, that's kind of building on the demand forecasting for CP7 as part of the periodic review, and then being supplemented by do something scenarios that look at capacity trade-offs and terminal developments to get growth over and above the do minimum. And that's what we'll be delivering this year. But then stage two of this work, which is, the purpose of this webinar, if you like, is to develop longer term options over the next 12 to 18 months. And this is very much using the call for evidence responses that we receive, supplementing those with demand forecasting for 2050, which take into effect a range of exogenous factors that have changed in recent years, Brexit, the HGV driver shortage, and things like that, to produce much longer term growth target options. So that's kind of the strategy approach, if you like, and the context for the commission. But the purpose of this agenda item is very much to focus on the call for evidence and why we need input into that to inform the longer term options. So to step back a little bit, why does the logistics industry need a growth target? I think it's important to try and demonstrate what the value of this growth target will be. So fundamentally, the industry need a sound evidence-based growth target to ensure that both government and GBR, including its regions, are incentivized to support modal shift. And the real value of the target will be that it will help to ensure that GBR and its regions are taking both policy and investment decisions that support the movement of more freight by rail. And I think this will lead to a few outcomes that will be beneficial for industry. So firstly, it will drive a positive cultural change, as it has done in Scotland, which will mean that GBR and its regions will be much more freight literate, as Helen mentioned, and have a much better freight capability integrated within the organisation. And in turn, that will lead to much more effective and efficient decision making on the network, which ultimately will deliver much better outcomes for your business and for our customers. So that's one of the main reasons that a growth target is needed. I think the further benefit will be, as our decision making improves, this should give you investors in rail much more confidence to plan your rail investment, so to help grow your business, because we'll be making much better decisions, coordinated decisions at the right time, and that will help you to plan much more efficiently. And lastly, I think as incentives and accountability are placed on GBR as an organisation to deliver for freight, this will mean that there will be much more proactive and collaborative in identifying new market opportunities. And I think that starts with the call for evidence, but will be a continuous process which will ultimately help to grow your business in both existing and new markets. So I think there's lots of value in a growth target for industry, essentially. So to develop that evidence-based target, we have launched a call for evidence on how to design and deliver a future freight growth target. We launched this back in July and it's open for 12 weeks. So there's still plenty of time to respond. It closes on the 27th of September. You can find the call for evidence document and the online form or response templates online. The slides will be shared afterwards, so you'll have access to the link there. But fundamentally, there are two parts to the call for evidence. So part one is all about meeting customers' needs. So it's trying to understand the needs and priorities of both current and future customers. And we really are trying to not only talk to existing customers in the rail market, but also customers, manufacturers, and logistics companies that are outside of rail as well. And the questions in part one are really intended to try and understand what the addressable modal shift market is. So where are there opportunities to grow traffic, to identify new terminals or facilities and that sort of stuff. And that will really help us to inform the development of our growth target options. But also we want to understand what the industry's perception is of engaging with the railways, so that we can try and improve our service offer for customers. The target audience for part one is quite varied, but I think for the most part, it's very much aimed at organisations that have an active role in the supply chain and the movement of freight around Great Britain. So sort of customers, manufacturers, logistics companies, operators, Roscoes, that sort of audience. And then the questions in part 2 are all about how the growth target should be designed and then crucially delivered. So from a design perspective, it's all about the metrics, the time frame in which the target should be measured, and the geographic scope of that target. So crucially, we're trying to get to the heart of how it should be designed most effectively to ensure that it's delivering for the industry. And then the second part of part 2, if you like, is all about how that target should then be delivered. So what are the concepts, the actions, or the trade-offs that are required to make sure that we are actually delivering that target for industry? And we invite respondents to give views on the role of the private and the public sector and how we can best work together to make sure that the target is ultimately delivered. So the previously described stakeholder groups are of course welcome to respond to part 2 as well, but here we've tried to broaden the types of questions so that the audience is accessible for STBs and rail partners and RDG and other industry stakeholders and interested organisations. So we strongly encourage your participation in this, of course. We really do want your input and where possible for you to raise awareness of this with your networks. It's probably worth mentioning that none of the questions in the call for evidence are mandatory. So we really do want you to respond and to maximise the engagement rate, if you like. We have made sort of a range of different questions. Some of those are open and encourage long responses, others are fairly closed, there's some tick boxes. So we've tried to be aware of people's time and other similar requests for calling for evidence. So we've tried to make it as accessible as possible, and I really would encourage you to submit a response of sorts, because of course it will be valuable in the first instance, but it will also be a useful catalyst for future conversations. So please do take the time to respond if it's of interest to you, and if you have any questions, you can contact the call for evidence email address there. I will finish by trying to sort of explain why we really need your input into this call for evidence and why I think it will be beneficial for your organisation. So fundamentally, we need your input so that we can ensure that the options that we are designing are delivering for the freight industry. We, of course, have our own views on how to do this, but to maximise its effectiveness and ensure that it's delivering for the industry, your views will be really important. Of course, we want the options that we present to be credible and evidence-based. So to do that, we need your input on what the realistic volume of goods is that could be moved by rail. So we have a sort of credible understanding of modal shift opportunities to make sure that the options that we're delivering are ambitious, but crucially that they're credible. And then this will help us to unlock positive policy and investment decisions, which I've touched on. We also need your input about where there are opportunities for new traffic flows and new terminal facilities. And I think this will lead nicely into the work that Guy's doing within the SFU to help us develop market-specific plans for each commodity and for the various markets, so that we have the overarching target that's credible and evidence-based, but we understand exactly how we're going to deliver that in each of the timeframes that we choose. And lastly, we need your input to understand what the barriers are that are preventing these opportunities from being realised. And this is really going to help us to improve our service offer as the SFU and working with the regions and to make sure that both our existing customers and our future customers, the work that we're doing complements your own growth strategies and aspirations for growth. So yeah, quite a lot in there, but I hope that you see the value of responding, because the responses really will inform the size of the target and how we go about delivering it. So I shall finish there and take any questions afterwards and hand over to Peter and Andy.
Thanks, Connor. I'm Peter Northfield. I'm from the team that's dealing with this commission that has already been discussed. Andy Bradford, my colleague, is from the Strategic Freight Unit within GBRTT. First, a word about the Commission itself. I think if you've read the DfT's consultation on the railways aspects of the transport bill that was put out over the summer, then you'll have seen that there was this principle that there should be a commission to GBRTT to look at industry processes. And could we move on a slide, please, Connor? I'm assuming you're driving. Thank you. We're focusing on three primary areas listed there. I'm leading that first work stream on train service design, capacity and timetabling, and supporting colleagues on the other two. Importantly, there's a fourth work stream that seeks to bring it all together, because so many of the mechanisms within the industry are overarching that each of the three subject work streams will inevitably be making recommendations about changes to the same products, the same mechanisms. So what are those mechanisms? At the top level, it's the law, the access and management regulations in particular. And at a level below that, there's the whatever license is created to GBR, and the directions and guidance from the Secretary of State to GBR. There's also the role of the ORR and the form of the track access contracts, and the regimes around those track access contracts, plus the criteria that ORR use to interpret the law in granting access. Then there are policies and processes. Some of them are governed by the industry, like the network code, and some of them will be GBR's own. GBR will have a statutory access policy of some form, which it will have to get approved by the Secretary of State, consult the industry on, and then get approved by the Secretary of State. So it'll say how it's going to grant access. So we've got to work out what needs to change in the existing documents that exist, and what should be in that new access policy. And in order to do that, we're talking to the industry, and we're talking to the various stakeholders and end users of the railway industry. We're working to quite a tight timescale given the agenda. We're in discussion with government throughout, as you might expect. And of course, things are changing quite fast at the moment. So we're expecting to close down a phase one of the commission around Christmas to make recommendations in the new year. And then there will be a phase two during 2023, probably up to about May or thereabouts, depending on the speed of the passage of the transport bill. Could we have the next slide, please, Connor? So why is this important? I think Helen and Connor have touched on this already, that the target on its own is a target, but you have to have mechanisms to deliver it. And one of the problems that we've been seeing with the current model, that's not to rubbish the current model. The current model did extremely well, particularly in delivering freight growth for perhaps 15 or 20 years after privatisation. There was a vast amount of growth, and it was accommodated on the railway very successfully. It's not done so well in the last 10 years, at least up until the pandemic, on a busy network. And we think some of the reasons for that, well, it's not just us. This was set out in the white paper in the Williams-Shapps Plan for Rail, that some of the processes are just not joined up. They're carried out by different parties, by DfT, by ORR, by Network Rail, by various industry parties in isolation, and they don't relate very well to each other. This is of particular interest to me, as I've spent the last 20 years trying to join these processes up across those divides. And sometimes you can do it and sometimes you can't. And when you can't, you get serious disbenefit and you fail to deliver the sort of outputs that the growth target would want to deliver. What we have now is a really exciting opportunity to change some of that and to try to join it up. So, next slide, Connor. Thanks. What are we trying to seek? Obviously, more joined up decision making, but what's that actually mean? I think it's really about ensuring that a guiding mind isn't an individual. It's teams of people across the industry led by organisations within GBR, so particularly the Strategic Freight Unit for freight capacity, working together in a coordinated fashion, so that change is planned, so that capacity is identified and, where necessary, reserved, ring-fenced. This is a massive change and potentially could unlock significant benefit delivery, which I know has been a problem for freight investment. And I think that principle alone is fundamentally important to delivery of the freight growth target, whatever it ends up being. Within that, that's not about locking down timetables at all. It's about trying to understand how we create the framework that gives best value out of the train service, whilst also enabling flexibility for day-to-day changes. Because one of the things we have learned, particularly through the pandemic period, is how important it is to be able to respond really quickly to market changes. And those market changes are going to keep on happening. So, next slide. Here's what we propose to do. Actually, since this has got your name on it, Andrew, do you want to come in and talk a little
bit? Happy to do so. Thank you, Peter. I think, yeah, what we the point we really want to get across here is that this commission from the department was to GBRTT to work with the industry, and that's what we've really set about trying to do here, and we must indeed continue to do. Over the last 6 weeks or so, I think our focus has been very much working with expert access practitioners, primarily in the freight operators, to understand the current challenges, to define those problem statements Peter has just talked about, and to start to develop that thinking that you just saw on the previous slide. Looking ahead, I think our focus over the coming weeks and into autumn is to really test and refine this thinking. And it's really important that we do this with our customers to ensure it addresses those problem statements that we worked together to define. So over the coming weeks, we have a plan to meet with several of the principal customers of rail freight, a couple of whom I'm pleased to see on this call today. And I think the offer that Peter and I very much wanted to put out here today is if we haven't engaged with you and you would like to speak to us, or if we don't have anything in the diary, please do get in touch. The really important thing here is that the proposals we're developing under this commission, they work for our customers and they are able to support the delivery of rail freight growth. And that's the commission that we've been given by the department, and that's what we must deliver. So please do get in touch.
Thanks, Andy. And I think we're handing over to Guy. No?
Guy, I think, yeah.
Morning all. Seamlessly came off mute and back on video. Good, yeah. So this follows on a bit from what Connor was saying, and to a degree as well what Peter was saying just then. So in the context of an organisation set up with a growth target looming in the background, is actually quite a positive place to start, because it suggests that actually we're going to have more traffic than we have today ultimately, which is a good thing and wasn't always guaranteed. And so within that background picture, we need to think a bit about what it is that GBRTT is going to do in the market, how that differs perhaps from Network Rail, and at the very least be a little bit more explicit about what we're going to be up to. So a number of you on the call, and I'm assuming there's a number of you on the call, I can't quite tell from the way this is set up, but a number of you on the call have helped me pull together what we've termed the market development plan over the last few months, and I hope to have completed that in the light of everyone's comments back by the end of this month. But broadly speaking, the market development plan sets out where GBR and specifically the Strategic Freight Unit sit in the market. So we're not BR, we're not going to run trains, we're not going to nationalise everything and have a road and rail plan or anything like that. Rather, what the work is that we're going to be doing is to sit upstream of the commercial activity that the FOX and end users are engaged in, to try and understand where the rail addressable market is, above and beyond the stuff we know well. Because if we are going to get something close to a tripling of rail freight, which isn't the target, but does feel like a gut feel kind of aspiration for 2050. We're going to be needing to do a lot more than we do today. And we're going to be needing to entertain on the rail people who aren't using rail freight today. So part of the work that we're going to be doing is that upstream market research, in part kicked off by the call for evidence. If Connor has got enough people to respond to it, and everybody on this call prints the hashtag for getting onto the call for evidence and pastes it onto their car keys, so in the autumn and summer, late summer party season, everybody can get to swap car keys and log on and attend to the call for evidence. That'd be great. And we're hoping to get a lot of feedback there from people who've never used rail before. And if we don't, well, we'll have to find other ways of penetrating the market and understanding what's going on. But we already, even in Network Rail, to a limited degree, have good quality one-to-one engagement with end users today. We will be wanting to expand our engagement with trade bodies and groups, such as RFG, such as Logistics UK, such as actually some of the other folks that we don't really deal with very much, like Institute of Grocery Distribution, people like that, to try and reach a wider audience and see to what extent the practice and experience of those who are on rail in any of those sectors today can copy and paste onto other players. And from that, then we can start to develop some strategies, understand why people aren't using rail at the moment, and begin to move the game forward. And our activity, as noted on this slide, is grouped around 4 pillars at the moment. A 5th was suggested, which we'll have a think about, but broadly informing. So that is the very basic work of, dealing with the rail curious, letting them understand how the rail offer works, how it could work, in general terms, not in commercial terms, and promotion, which is where we use our voice collectively to expound the benefits of rail freight from an environmental and congestion and everything else backdrop. Enabling is the work where we actually, put together plans that will actually develop new terminals, tactical interventions on the network, et cetera, and then delivery, which frankly will be through the devolved regions where it involves infrastructure. Having some kind of an oversight of that to make sure that we're getting benefit for freight, which will include obviously pathing and path creation as well. That overarching plan saying where we're going to sit and what we're going to do generally will be supported beneath that by the real detail, which I envisage taking the form of commodity digests, where we regularly take stock of these markets, what the addressable market is, top 5 things that we might need to get on with. Okay, we're on the next slide. And then also we'll have a freight estate strategy, which will sit behind that, which will properly explain how we intend to use our freight estate to best advantage for modal shift. And then finally, the shop window of what we're up to, which is the scheme plan. So at any moment, everybody will be able to get a view as to what we're on with, where we're on with it. That scheme plan won't have any commercial details on it because it's going to be public facing. But everyone will know whose scheme is whose, or each person will know who their scheme is on that plan. So commodity digest, as I've just said, looking at particular commodities, both those that exist today, so construction and autos and intermodal, the various different segments of the intermodal network market, but also potentially looking into newer markets, express freight, urban logistics. Where's that at? What do we need to do? Informed by direct contact with potential and existing participants in those markets. And for each of them, top 5, top 10 actions for growth, so that we can be very clear in articulating what we're going to be up to. Next slide, Connor. The scheme development plan, this is the way I see this at the moment. It's a fairly long list of prospects at the moment, but at the top end of it is stuff we'll be on with in the next 0 to 24 months, and then a 2 to 5 year version, and then a 5+, taking us all through to retirement perhaps. But yes, at any time, some indication as to what we're up to, who we're up to it for, where things are going to be happening. And one of the things that fell out of this quite early on in discussions between Andrew Haynes and the then Rail Minister last year, and again, some of you have aided me on this, was a very specific ask in the intermodal sector about terminal distribution. The kind of the minister was interested in the way that SRFIs are kind of clumped together around the country. And so some basic explanation as to why that might be. And moreover, shining a light on the fact that that model alone won't deliver the geography of rail freight terminals that we might desire to really boost the domestic intermodal sector. There are rail freight deserts around the country, which all of us know about. So we've had some work done on that within the guise of, or under the reference terms of the market development plan, a very specific focus on what we might be able to do there, and try and point to some actions and get some industry support for that. So scheme development plan, all the different bits and bobs are on with, but put public rather than just us hiding in the attic, getting on with it quietly. Is there another slide, Connor? Of mine, I mean? No, there we go, discussion. So, so they're a bit of a roundup of what we're up to on the market development side, but happy to take comments and questions afterwards.
Brilliant. So thank you very much, Guy, and also Helen, Connor, Peter and Andy for that, for a whistle-stop through reform, shall we say. If only all reform meetings and documents could be this concise, we'd probably be in a better place. But there we go. Connor, could you just drop your slides, please, so we could see people sort of in slightly bigger heads? And then we will go to questions. We've got a couple in, but if you've been sitting on a question, please do, drop it into the Q&A or the chat now. We've got plenty of time. But before we just get into those that have been posted, I just a couple of clarifications that might be helpful, I think, for me. Peter and Andy, you talked about there being 4 work streams in the Commission. And then obviously you've talked in more detail about access, which is obviously hugely important for freight. In terms of the other work streams, particularly those on operations and critically, obviously, access to terminals, how should people interact with you on that? Is it through the same mechanism, or are there other people that they ought to be talking to?
No, I think basically we are the way in. So just contact us, and it's a lean team, and we will make sure that everything finds its appropriate specialist.
Cool. And on the terminals one, because we've got a number of people on who operate terminals, are we expecting that work will have material impact on people who operate freight depots and terminals? Material.
I don't think we're looking for substantial radical change in terms of the model. The key focus for the Commission is on the 3 areas that were listed. And you'll have noticed that freight terminals wasn't specifically listed. I mean, the third work stream was stations and depots, which was far more the regulated depots, the sort of light maintenance depot type arrangements, because we identified that we thought, listening to a certain amount of feedback, that that's where the biggest benefits were in changing the regime. However, that 4th work stream is looking at the whole framework of the access management regs, as far as which, of course, potentially covers everything. So the key is to try and make sure that any changes that are recommended to those regulations don't have unintended consequences, and that's why it's so important that we talk to people who operate, for instance, freight terminals.
Okay. And just sorry, forgive me on this. There isn't going to be any routes through this where, the sites that Guy references in his land strategy, which are GBR owned as freeholders, will be treated under a different regime to those owned by others, I assume.
I don't think so. No, I mean, the fact that we may be freeholder at site sort of gets obscured as soon as anybody takes tenure and operates the site. You don't today really see the difference. And I wouldn't imagine there would be a need for a different regulatory regime. No. You might get quite interested if somebody starts to be a bit obstructive, even if they are paying us rent and running traffic. And I guess, Peter will know more, some form of open access regime would apply, and the regulator might get interested if people do start being difficult.
Okay, yeah. Thank you.
And that, sorry, if I can just finish off on that, that's why the link to the regs is so important, because it's what gives the regulator the powers to step in and understanding exactly what that tipping point is something that, we're interested in feedback. Do people think that needs a shift?
But I think there's a more general point that you only get those kind of behaviours, or those kind of behaviours only inhibit market growth if you don't have enough terminals. So my objective is we have enough terminals that if they want to, everybody can be a bit protective and commercially minded about their particular facility, but there's enough that means there's space for any particular entrant to be able to use a terminal. So if, we've only got one terminal in a particular area, the answer isn't necessarily the regulator getting heavy-handed, it's, well, why haven't we got another one? Obviously there's market demand.
Yeah, cool. All right, let's look at the questions that are coming in. Okay, first up, one from Carl. I think this is probably coming your way, Connor. France have committed to grow rail freight from 9% of total transport to 18%. Germany have committed to grow rail freight from 19% to 25%. What methodologies did they use to determine the level of increase? Do we know anything about that?
Yeah, thanks, Maggie. Thanks, Carl, for the question. I think the short answer is we don't know. I'll be completely honest. We have tried as part of this commission to do a bit of a lessons learned exercise with both Scotland and partners in Europe as well. And we've had a lot of success on the Scotland front in terms of speaking to Transport Scotland, but also end users in the Scottish market, but less so on the European front. So we have tried to access that market from a few different routes, and all have led to similar responses of just tremendously busy and not able to engage at this time. But I would like to continue trying, but we don't know at this moment, unfortunately.
And kind of just at the moment, if I look out across the markets and the economy at the moment, and perhaps grateful I'm not Liz Truss for many reasons, but one of them being that obviously the UK is, like many other countries, facing a bit of an economic crisis with high inflation, low growth. And we're already seeing, I think, in the freight market signs of, stagnation, not in terms of people's rail aspirations, but in terms of the total amount of stuff that's being moved. And I just wonder how that's going to factor into the thinking about a growth target, because, of course, if we see the exogenous market shrink, a recession, then the ambition for rail is still really strong, but the results might not back that up in the way that we hoped. Is that about how we express it as a share or as an absolute, or what's the thinking around that?
Are you moving to the camera there, Helen, because you want to take that one?
As I have a view, I can do.
Yeah, you took that one, Connor. Well done. Well spotted.
I'm still here. There are a number of things outside the railway's control that could affect whether we do or don't hit a rail freight growth target. So partly, I think it's really important to have one so that we have something to aim at, and so that the processes and behaviours are put in place that are favourable to freight, so that rail freight can maximise the benefit whatever the external happenings are. So there might be a sudden economic boom and rail freight might grow hugely regardless of what the railway does, but that's not good if we're still rubbish to interact with and people are doing it by default because they have to, because the roads are even worse. Equally, yeah, there could be, may well be, a recession, and the volume of goods overall could be reduced. I would want to be a bit bullish and say, well, let's go for modal shift then, and see if we can still grow rail freight and abstract from roads, because it's better from a congestion perspective, it's better from an environmental perspective, and we want it to be better from a business perspective as well. So in terms of hitting the growth targets, we need to be able to frame it in such a way that what is also being measured, perhaps internally, kind of thinking as I speak here, is the intent to deliver it. So what are the actions that need to be put in place in order to deliver it, to make the railway easier to interact with? So you can't just go, no, we didn't hit our freight growth target this time, but it's all rubbish out there, so of course we didn't, kind of casually ignoring the fact that you haven't carried out any of the actions that would have enabled you to hit it, even if there'd been a booming economy. So it will need to be a mixture of both a kind of numeric, this is the level of growth we need to see, and action plan of, and this is what is needed in order to achieve it. And if you can do all the things that are needed to achieve it, but there's been a horrible recession and the industry overall has shrunk, it's like, well, I mean, it's going to be rubbish for the country at large, but there is only so much you can do. I'm not yet in a position to alter the entire economic forecast of the UK.
Yeah, keep working on that one, Helen.
Give me time.
Cool. Yeah, thank you. Agree with that. All right. Question. What have we got? Let's move on to a slightly different topic. One in from Phil. Likely many responders will identify two problems: lack of network capacity, lack of rail served terminals. The first is going to require support of the Treasury. The latter, Department of Levelling Up Housing and Communities in terms of the planning framework. What influence does GBR and indeed DFT eventually have, or will have, or likely to have in future with these other government departments?
Okay, so within the market development plan, we have deliberately made clear our intention to engage far earlier and more effectively with local authorities and sub-regional transport bodies to make sure they are sited early on where our freight estate is within their geographies, what it is we intend to do with different sites, and take that through to ensuring that there is consistent land use zoning policy, that local authorities are aware that they have a number of active and or potentially active sites within their areas, so that rather than allow ourselves to get to, virtually the day of the race of constructing something and the locals kick off, that actually you've got local authority and council support behind you whilst it's still an idea and whilst they're still seeking to satisfy their planning policy conditions about modal shift, so that then when you actually announce something happening or somebody actually takes tenure of a site and starts developing it, you've had some background to get to that particular point. That's something that's missing today. The component parts are actually there today. We do have town planning teams in each of the routes and regions. There's a degree of inconsistency in their views on permitted development rights, etc. But so that's something that doesn't actually cost very much to get our act together and engage with these people, but it's something we want to do with the development team. And I would suggest that it's not all about getting cash from Treasury to achieve these aims. There's a good deal that could be done by thinning out and moderating the passenger service to reflect the number of people who actually want to use it nowadays. That creates capacity. And the terminals, frankly, are always a privately funded enterprise. We need to be a little bit more cunning about how we assess business cases for developments, but if we own the land, that's a big chunk of the problem solved to begin with, and it's then a matter of influencing routes and regions as to how we actually use our land most effectively to get modal shift. So it'd be lovely to have a big pot of cash, but that's not necessarily the only way of getting the growth that we're after.
Yeah, thanks.
Could I come in and build on that a little bit, Maggie? I think Guy's absolutely right. When it comes to network capacity, either you're in a growth environment, in which case both the public and private sector are more willing to invest. What they need in order to make that investment is consequence that the benefits will be realised, and the industry hasn't been particularly good at protecting those benefits for the investment for the purpose of the investment, and that's one of the things that we absolutely have to change. If you're not in a growth environment, then you have to be able to make those tough choices about what's the best use of the existing capacity on the network. And at the moment, the mechanisms for doing that are not as straightforward as they might be, and that's another thing that I think we could change to benefit freight growth.
Thank you.
One thing in terms of network capacity, I think what we all need to focus on is making better utilisation of what we have. There's lots of you can stand at many a station and see an intermodal train go past, and there's lots of empty wagons at the moment. And I know there's various factors outside of rail, but what can we do to fill those spaces, be clever and last minute selling a space to be able to utilise that, and also capacity that's held. How can we make a better use of it, use it more smarter, and get a better utilization of that? If we will get growth through doing that, and that doesn't rely on investment from Treasury either. So it's a whole host of things, and I think all of us need to work together to get better utilization of what we have already.
Yeah, agree. Okay, one, I think probably Guy coming your way from Alex Reynolds around the planning and land strategy, which I think you've almost answered already, but you know, is a greater network of SRFIs the target?
I'll come off mute to answer that one. Well, so it depends what I mean by SRFI. So SRFI is great. Yes, there are plenty in the wings to come forward, probably in areas that we'd all know and love as part of the existing railway landscape. You cannot force a market-led model into areas where planning policy, land availability and warehousing demand don't support the SRFI model. That's why we have gaps around the country. So I'm particularly interested in GBR's role in promoting intermodal interchanges out with the SRFI model at some of those areas, which is broadly, as our research has shown, southwest, northeast, southeast particularly. The SRFI model isn't necessarily going to work in those areas, but there is a demand for an intermodal offer. And so we need to be a bit cuter about how we stack the economics to ensure that that there is a facility for people to use rail, which is entirely absent at the moment. I mean, if you're in Devon or Cornwall, it's not even an option to use rail for freight because there aren't any bloody terminals of any consequence down there. So that's the thing we need to tackle. So yes, intermodal interchanges, a greater disposition of them, whether they are freestanding things or whether they are part of a larger privately invested warehousing complex, don't mind. I'm ambivalent about that. Just places to get to rail is the important thing.
Cool. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. And I think we're still waiting on DFT to come forward with a call for evidence on planning more generally, as well as the MPS consultation, which should have been out before the summer, but clearly wasn't. So we'll see what emerges on those two. Okay, a question from Les. There'll be no increase in freight unless a supply chain to support this, absolutely. For example, wagons, components, supplies, and so on. What can GBR doing to assist support this key part of the freight business? Let's take that one.
I think I said earlier on, we're not BR, so I don't think we're going to have wagons or run trains. I mean, it's interesting, actually. It's a good question, and one that we faced when we came out of the 08-13 crunch, and the aggregate sector were quite exercised about there not being enough wagons. And in the end, the market responded because we in government took too long dithering about whether we were going to invest in wagons or not. So my view would be supply chain problems with, parts of the world that used to make lots of wagons and are now busy doing other things like fighting the Russians. Assuming those situations resolve themselves to some degree, I would hope to see the market respond. But I might be wrong. Maybe then we need to think a bit more about how we do stuff. But I think, a publicly owned Roscoe or something like that pumps the market full of subsidized wagons, I don't know. Let's see where we get to on that.
Yeah, I mean, I imagine, and perhaps as we'll have a chat sometime offline, but, the sort of work that around supply groups done around supporting the supply chain or, other factors around there, perhaps something that we need to think about a bit more than we have done.
Yeah,
and help support the industry rather than do it.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. And maybe there's some cunning stuff we could actually do by looking over our internal fence between our engineering haulage division and the rest of the railway. Maybe if we are putting in series orders for pieces of kit that could have wider market application, perhaps we could join that together better, which we just don't at the moment. So there's an opportunity there, perhaps.
Cool. Okay, Tim Morris, measures like MSRS, modal shift rev support have been important in supporting the growth we've already seen, but that's outside GBR's decision making. How are GBR thinking about progressing important mechanisms like that? Will MSRS transfer to GBR? Question.
So, unless anybody else wants to jump in, we're not expecting MSRS to transfer to GBR, not least because it's not just a rail incentive. So that, I think, is pretty straightforward. One of the pieces of work that we need to do over the next 6 to 12 months to inform GBR is to look at what policy incentives would look like in order to incentivize rail freight growth. What are the, what do you need to do to make rail a more commercial choice for end users over road? Where are the disparities between road and rail at the moment in terms of government policy, and what would you need to put in place to overcome those, and then to make those recommendations to the Department for Transport. And it might just be more MSRS. It might. I can't say that it isn't. I'd be really surprised if it was, but it might. But until we've done that piece of work, I imagine there will be a suite of options that you can recommend policy changes towards road freight. You can recommend policy changes for rail freight, or a mixture of both. It won't be a clear, this is the only answer that you can do. But that's a piece of work that's yet to be done. But I thoroughly agree that we need to look at what the incentives are for rail and how they can drive growth.
Cool, thank you. Okay, and then
possibly
sorry,
just adding to that, and this will get people spitting their mid-morning croissants out, is MSRS actually a useful mechanism anyway? Are there other ways that you can incentivize modal shift rather than just giving the same people the same money for moving the same boxes week by week? Perhaps there's something else that could actually encourage the market to take a risk, cover off the commercial risk at the outset of a service, perhaps. Don't know, discussion point.
Cool. Yeah, and one I'm pretty confident we'll come back to, but let me just take the last question, because we're right up on time before we go down an MSRS debate, which we probably need to do, but perhaps not now. From Lee Armstrong, number one, warehousing is more lucrative than rail terminals, so we might need stronger legislation to force more planning requirements around use of rail is needed. Is that in scope? And number two, what can be done to reduce the cost of new connections to the rail network to reduce the price of entry for new terminals and users? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, the first one, good point. Absolutely, it's disgraceful the amount of distribution space being consented at the moment with no thought whatsoever as to how it's going to function in the next 10, 20 years' time. That said, one can only hope that some of the tenants taking these sheds, or certainly some of the bigger players who we already know to be, wanting to join the rail family, might start to vote with their feet, and there might be a greater preponderance of rail connected schemes forthcoming. And that was a sentiment that we put back in a letter from an objector to one of the current crop of SRFIs, that don't start worrying about traffic over a level crossing and et cetera, at this particular facility, because you've got no issue with consenting thousands and thousands of square meters of distribution space with no rail connection. So why you're picking on this one. Secondly, cost of rail connections. Yeah, it's exorbitant. I think there's a lot of work always to be done on challenging the scope that some of the contractors come out with. That for me is the way that we've taken cost out of connections previously. It's not a cheap business connecting to the railway. It's very solid infrastructure that'll be there for another 50 to 100 years, but it doesn't mean it needs to cost an arm and a leg from the outset. And one day, maybe we'll be in a position to start thinking more creatively about how you actually fund those things. So it's less of a CapEx hurdle up front for a developer. But that said, if you're building an SRFI, yes, the rail component might be a fairly sizable chunk of the cost, but they're pretty juicy enterprises. I'm more worried about the cost of connections to facilities that don't have the kind of cash cow that warehousing represents. Why haven't we got more rail connected quarries, car factories and other things? That's a really interesting point. So it's absolutely valid comment. It'd be great if we can do something about that in a new organizational structure, in a way in which we contract and hand out and deliver connection works to the network.
Thank you, guys. Thank you. Right. I think we could carry on. I've certainly got a whole string of questions, but it is myself, but it is 10 o'clock. So I will keep them back for other conversations and other days. If you did not get a question in, or you come away from this with a burning question, I think you've got the emails on the slides, or if not, come through to me and we can certainly put you in touch with the right people. Please do look at the call for evidence and get your responses in by the deadline, which is the 27th of September, or was it 29th, Connor? Can't remember, 27th.
27th.
Yeah, Phil is drafting the Rail Freight Group response. So if you want to send Phil any key points that you think should be in our response, please do that, or come through me if you've not got Phil's email. And if you want a copy of the slides from today, I think we're okay to send them out. So please drop Yvonne or myself an email and we can get you a copy of those slides as well. And, I think what we've heard today is, a really helpful and interesting update on the work that's happening it's apparent how much work there is yet still to do. And I think, you know, in my conversations with colleagues who've spoken today, they are really keen to have your input and to have your thoughts, particularly those of you who are customers, terminal developers, you know, the wider part of the market than just the freight operators, who are, of course, obviously very much involved. So please don't hold back. Get your thoughts in to the consultation, or indeed at any time. So thank you very much for listening in. Thank you very much to Connor for his work in arranging today, to Peter, to Andy, to Helen, to Guy and to Richard for their comments and thoughts. Enjoy the rest of your day, and hopefully see some of you at our awards dinner on Thursday. Take care.
Thanks, Maggie.